Good evening, everyone. My name is Ebony Morris, and I, along with Doreen Rochelle, are the co-chairs of the Professional Development Committee for the National Bar Association Women Lawyers Division. Welcome to our webinar, From Startup to Public Companies, Navigating Transactional Legal Issues. Our webinar tonight will cover the various legal issues impacting startup and public companies. Our webinar is eligible for 1 hour of CLE credit, and you will receive a certificate of completion following the webinar. Please also be sure to participate in our poll questions, which will be displayed throughout our webinar. Now I will introduce our wonderful panelists. So first we have Stephen Abreu, who is a partner with Sidley Austin in the San Francisco office. Stephen is a partner in the Technology and IP Transactions and Global Life Sciences Department, where he focuses on structuring and negotiating complex intellectual property and commercial transactions for life sciences companies, including strategic collaborations, cross-border transactions, and co-development, license, and manufacturing agreements. Next, we have Theresa Bost, who is the executive leader and general counsel of Jazz Pharmaceuticals. Theresa is an influential executive with extensive legal experience who serves global and US-based organizations. She is a strategic leader with broad experience in healthcare and life sciences pharmaceutical industries. We also have Carlene DeRocher, who is General Counsel and Chief Compliance Officer, Corporate Secretary, and Director of Technology Development of Forsyth Institute. Carlene is a legal and business professional with more than 18 years of experience. Next, we have Gary Prado, Senior Legal Counsel of Fidelity Investments, where he serves as the primary legal support to Fidelity's private equity venture capital business. Prior to joining Fidelity, he worked at Ropes & Gray, where his practice focused on representing private equity firms and public and private companies in mergers and acquisitions, leveraged buyouts, and other direct investments. Finally, we have Winston Henderson, who is also a chef. He mentioned that before we started the recording, but he is the Vice President and General Counsel of Clear Scientific, Inc., a life science company that he founded in 2019. He previously served as General Counsel of Nanoterra, Inc. and Surface Logic, Inc., and was part of the founding teams for both C2 Sense, Inc. and Sankofa, Inc. So before we dive into the questions, let's do the first poll question for the audience. Okay, so can you please give us a sense of what your current role is? And also please be sure to X out of the poll box once it's completed. All right. So we have 50% of in-house counsel and 50% students. So I do have a correction, Theresa, my apologies. So you are how about you tell the audience what your current role is?
I just wanted to correct the misstatement. I'm not the general counsel of Jazz. I have previously been general counsel at another company and just an executive legal leader, and especially in the life sciences, healthcare technology space.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that correction and my apologies. So let's talk about a little bit more about your current role, a description of your department and the type of companies that you have supported in your role. Theresa, would you like to kick it off?
Sure, I'd love to kick it off. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here on this panel with this esteemed colleagues or panelists here. So I have managed a number of different types of teams. I've been an in-house lawyer most of my legal career. In the last 20 years, I've been really focused on the healthcare space, both in life sciences, pharmaceutical, healthcare technology. And I have managed large teams, global teams. Well, I would say large teams up to about 12 individuals globally in Europe and the US, both East and West Coast. I've also managed small teams as part of my startup experience. I had a very small team of actually mostly non-lawyers, but really focused and experienced individuals in their specialty. So I have been in those spaces. I've also worked for a late stage startup company as well as multiple public companies as well.
Hi, it's Carlene. I could go next. So,
Ebony, you're on mute.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as Ebony mentioned, I'm general counsel at the Forsyth Institute. And the Forsyth Institute is a research institute. So it's kind of a cross between academic and I guess academic and commercialization type of organization, right? So we're a very lab heavy type of environment, but we're also very much focused on tech translation. And so for the legal department, it's a very small legal department. It's a legal department of, when I think of legal and compliance, there are about 3 of us. And if we count the law students that we manage over the course of the year that come through, it's about 6 people. So we're very much focused on making sure that I build the right relationships with outside counsel, the specialists that can help me dive deeper when I need to dive deeper on specific specialty areas, whether it's employment, it's regulatory. Many times if it's a super complex licensing transaction, I'll use outside counsel as my sounding board and also a buffer in that transaction to give the internal in-house legal department a little cover. So it's a small group. Forsyth has been around for 111 years. So I like to say we are a 111-year-old startup. It very much feels like a startup in terms of the internal workings of the organization.
Thank you. Winston?
Yeah, so I think I'll focus on the parts of my practice that or my career that have been a little different. I did the big firm thing. I was an IP litigator in New York, and then decided and was interested in the innovation economy, and luckily got the chance to be an early employee in a Harvard spinout in the life science space, and stayed there for a while until we exited that, and then stayed in a supporting role to that company that then was financed by a large private equity firm and then went public, and then went to a couple of other companies, and then started this as general counsel, and then started this company with my 4 co-founders in 2019. And so I've kind of been in the innovation space since leaving the law firm, and that practice is varied, right? And it depends, it's varied on the economy, it's varied in the technology, and it's varied in the stage and the types of investors. And so hopefully I can lend some insight into that. Most of the departments have been small because of G&A and innovation companies, you try to keep that spend flexible and low. And so I tell people most of the time I've been general counsel and very specific counsel, because I've been between 1 and 3. Usually have a significant spend because all the deals from IP to transaction are very, very complex. So you need to get to, more than having someone in-house, you need to get to the expertise really, really fast so that you can execute expertly and quickly without anybody really having to come up to speed except those pieces that touch the company. So we know companies best, we know the risk analysis, and we access the experts.
Thank you. Stephen?
Yes. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. As Ebony mentioned, my name is Stephen Abreu. I am a partner in the San Francisco office. I specialize in intellectual property heavy agreements, license agreements, collaboration agreements, almost entirely in the biotech space. I have a scientific background, undergrad and graduate degrees in biochemistry and molecular biology, and I've always wanted to be in the space, in the biotech space. So when I finally went to law school, focused on this particular area. Happy to be here and happy to contribute.
Thank you. And Gary.
Thanks, Ebony, and thank you for the generous introduction. And so I'm Senior Legal Counsel at Fidelity Investments, and Fidelity Investments is a very interesting place. It's a private company, it's family owned, and it has a very large legal department. I mean, we have over 200 lawyers in-house and growing. And so we try to leverage our internal expertise before going to outside counsel. So we usually try, right, to call around and see if we can get the answer to some of the questions that arise during the day-to-day. And then we leverage outside counsel for the expertise, as Winston noted earlier. And I would say that in my role as a primary contact to Devonshire Investors, the private equity arm, it's essentially being a general counsel to the registered investment advisor. And we liaise with compliance for compliance matters. We support all deal activities, usually with outside counsel, because we just don't have the bandwidth to paper the deals. And again, I mean, whenever we're looking for outside counsel, we're looking for expertise, right? I mean, to take a page out of Winston's book, right? Like, we know the business, we know the issues that the business has. We just need someone that's able to partner with us and lend that expertise and be able to advise us on what's market on these deals. So, right, so we're entering, right, so we feel comfortable in the negotiations and some of the terms that we have to accept that we wouldn't otherwise, right, that we negotiate per se. And before that, as you mentioned, I was an M&A attorney at Ropes and Gray, representing primarily big private equity buyout firms.
Gary. So for our in-house people, what is your approach to leading your legal department? And Winston, why don't you start first?
So this is going to be really easy. Like I said, because I worked with small league departments. We've only burgeoned, for example, when we were trying to do a terminal M&A or some others, and then you kind of build up towards that. And then I think as Carlene said, we highly leverage young talent. One of my things I like to do is easier for me to give some people some experience, because usually they have expertise to help me go through massive amounts of everything from patent searches to document review to getting diligence ready, and that's for people of color. And sometimes I'm able to, in those points and inflection points, use best practice to give people a shot and some mentoring, and they give me their expertise, which is usually some really smart, detail-oriented people who get me through some legs for a price point that I can afford. So that's just one of the, sometimes we burgeon when I'm doing those types of things. And so even in those times, my main job is to execute, right? And a lot of times, as people can attest, it takes time to figure out what the needs of the company are, because they are in individuals' heads and they're in rooms that you have to create and orchestrate, right? And not get in the way, right? And so that means that my personal time is taken up. And so when you're managing, you try to make it manageable for someone who sometimes you don't sit down to review things in detail, really thoughtfully, till 6 o'clock, right? And that's when you're starting. And so when you want to get to manage, you want to figure out, how do I get either from outside counsel or the CFO's direct reports or something that people have thought about. I've given them enough direction to figure out what's crisp. And the way I tell people is this: when President Obama will go to bed at night, and even I'm a biography buff, So if you read presidents, you figure, how do they do it, right? If they can do it with foreign policy, things they don't have any expertise on, and everything is critical. They go to bed with a binder at night. That's what I try to get to. How do I manage it so that I get to read those things where I choose the right people and I say, here are the things we really care about, but it's your expertise. What should I care about? Right? Here's what I care about. You let me know what I should care about. Don't just listen to me. That's not right. And then, but let's synthesize it to the point where dumb it down for me. It's not my area of expertise. Make it crisp where I can figure out where I need to deep dive, and I'll do the same for you. And then I try to manage that to the rest of the organization because their time is limited as well. And they don't care about 102, section 102A, right? They're saying, can I get this intellectual property? Can I get this license? And what impact does it have on the business? And no, I didn't think about foreign rights. I didn't think about this. That's your job. So how do I orchestrate those things? So managing with enough digging into expertise to map out the risk and the reward for the entire organization. And I drive it from there. And then from there, it really comes down to people, right? Managing, sometimes I have experts. Those experts are really expensive. I don't want to pay for a lot of their time. How do I get them to get me the answer and then hang up the phone, right? And no, don't write the memo, hang up the phone, shoot it to me an email. And so I'm really budget constrained as well. Not that we don't have budget, but I'm not trying to blow it with someone who wants to pontificate, right? I'm like, that dude, that's not moving the ball. I know you're smart enough to dumb us down, right? Make it crisp. And so I know that's not the most 60-minute book where you have 15 pages that tells you how to manage things, but it allows me to put together what I consider like a snack map. Can I get everything down to a snack map where I can see the entire business or all the issues in a snack map or an executive summary? And that really comes from my consulting days, because between engineering and law school, I was a consultant. A consultant does this really well. Lawyers do not do this very well. Lawyers like to be smart and complete. They're not concise, and they don't communicate that well, right? Consultants know how to do it very well. And so I kind of use a consulting style of communication and management. And I know that's not the best answer. I can go into it in any depth in Q&A, but that's the best answer I can get right now. And I tell you, managing, sorry about this, as you can imagine, nothing's harder than managing these calls during COVID. So you may see various family members around dinner time float in and out, which is why I have my virtual background. I apologize in advance. Hopefully it's humorous, but for those who find it annoying, I honestly apologize in advance.
No worries, no complaints from us. Carlene, what about you?
Sure, I think I'll build off of what Winston said, right? Because again, coming from like a small legal department, I think another important piece is the managing relationships across the organization and leveraging those resources, right? So it's that dotted line. So because it's a small department and it's legal and, I oversee compliance, we're doing risk management and those type of things at the Institute. It's building teams. So institutional compliance working group, for example, that's cross-functional across the key organizations. You pull the key members of those groups together and say, this is an example. Let's do a gap analysis to see where we are in terms of policies. We'll work together for the next 6 months and identify those gaps, and then build a plan as to how will we, look at what we found and then figure out how to address and maybe build new policies that will fill some of those gaps. And for a project like that, it's less about legal and compliance. It's more about the other organizations getting involved and helping me do my job better. One point that Winston said that I thought that I think is very important, it's the communication piece, right? And the collaboration piece. For me, I'm collaborative, I'm transparent, and very much focused on from the onset, here's the goal of this specific project, or we're looking at a specific issue. Here are the initial thoughts. Here's where I think it might go. Let's work together to see if we could get to where we want to go.
Theresa, do you have anything to add?
Sure. I think, again, building off, I think what Winston already said, and Carlene, I think really, and I think Winston mentioned it, really my focus is to always make sure I have very competent and experienced people on my team. I've run kind of the gamut of inheriting teams to being able to build and hire my own teams. I also think it's really important to hire your support staff that, well experienced support staff. Because I think you can delegate a lot of work to paralegals and to administrative assistants. I think also it's really important for me to provide my team stretch opportunities and opportunities for visibility within the organization. So wherever I can give them a project or align them, kind of, Carlene, you said cross-functionally with a more senior person on, the business development team or in the product team, or even if they can come to, I had one of my team members come to a board meeting to help do the training of our board when we had to do compliance training. And I think, offering them those opportunities to shine, I think is really important for their own development. And so that's really important to me as well. I think I also have leveraged kind of law students as well as that started out as interns and kind of stayed through the year, and it gave them an opportunity to kind of get some hands-on experience. It kind of leveraged me to use their research insight, right? That we all are a little grown out of, especially in-house. So it's great to have a law student who, can tackle some of the research, especially if there's new and exciting things that the company or projects that are happening. So I think those are the only things that I would add. But I think it's really important. I also do have to try to touch base with my team members on a weekly basis, individually as well as a group, always reminding them that, we need to be a nice, tight, knit group, because we often, in the legal department, depending on what is going on, we will have access to information that others in the organization won't have access to. Some of it is very sensitive, confidential. Some may be conflicting. And so trying to make sure that we are as collaborative and as close-knit as we need to be. So making sure I take the opportunity to have a team meeting on a weekly basis, touch base with them individually as much as I can, to give them the opportunity. I think, Winston, you mentioned it, just to kind of get my ear, run something by me, or I can run something by them really quickly. And I think that especially was effective when I was managing non-lawyers on my team who were specialists who really needed just a little bit of guidance. They didn't have the legal background. And so it was really helpful to be able to touch base with them. They usually had a running list of items that they needed to get to me, and so those were really effective, I think. I think that's what I would like to add.
Thank you. So Theresa, how are you able to balance your team having independence versus the appearance of micromanaging?
Yeah, I always like to tell people I am not a micromanager. I don't have time to be, right? And I think that's why I really want to have competent and experienced people on my team. I want them to have accountability. I want them to know that I'm here. I have their back if they need me. But I want them to feel like they own. There's a certain bolus of work or category of work that's on their plate that they own. And I want them to feel empowered that they can do that. But I'm always here for my team, always have their back, especially when there's, issues with business people, or if they're getting, conflicting messages from, more senior individuals. Like I'm happy to be that mediator for them when necessary, or even mentor and coach them to kind of address the situation themselves versus me stepping in whenever I can.
Thank you.
Can I add to that too?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah,
so in addition to that too, I think I also would like to think I'm not a micromanager. So what I try to tell the team in the current environment, as well as my previous in-house role where I was senior corporate counsel and I managed junior attorneys, it's creating tools, right? Create a tool that will help you present the information to me in a way that's organized and that I feel like you have everything covered. And so in many instances in this current role, when it comes to governance, board meetings and prepping for board meetings, we literally have a checklist. And so the compliance analyst that manages that has the checklist, and it's like clockwork at a certain period of time before the board meeting, like a month and a half before, the planning starts, and you can expect what's coming down the pipeline because she's following that checklist. And so it allows, I think, the members of the team to be more independent because they know what level of reporting up they need to do. So they're free to kind of do the work that they're doing and check in using those tools to help keep the communication on track.
Thank you. So Winston, how do you manage a pre-existing team in forging the relationship while also ensuring progress during the transition?
Yeah, so pre-existing teams, I put in the same bucket as new people. So it's a different relationship. So you're either inheriting your team. The only difference there is you supposedly have control over whether that team remains that team. You don't always, either substantively or actually, right? Sometimes you inherit some people that you can't move for one reason or another. And the same thing for the rest of the organization. I find the in-house practice, one of the most challenging things about the in-house practice is not managing the people under whom you have control. It's them and their interactions with other people. Managing what does it mean to go to legal? Where does legal fit in, right? Is it helpful? Is it inhibitory, right? Is it detailed enough? Are your people empowered to help you manage the risks or the upside? And then there's the human component to it, which is probably the difficult part. And so in some ways where you have the ability to have the time to build the trust, even when you're pacing someone out. I mean, usually what I like to say is I want everybody who works for me and with me to feel like it was a better experience, even if they move on. I mean, I've helped more people get a much better paying job and a happier job once they leave me or leave the organization than not, right? Because that's a dedication I make to them. They have to be a real piece of work for me not to dedicate that time to them because it's human, and I want to have that impact on the world, and I bring that to work. And so when you go with that trusting relationship, even when they are a menace, right? You kind of go into that headspace and say, okay, if Dr. King was a practicing attorney, what would he do in this moment? He wouldn't choke somebody. He would, if Kofi Annan was in this, what would he do? And so I go into that mode, and I try to get helpful, and also try to figure out. Most people want to do a good job. They don't necessarily want to work all 24 hours. So you say, if you don't want to work 24 hours, how do I help you manage this better in a way that works for me and everybody else? You want to have control. How do you develop that relationship with the business partner that allows you to be at the table where you're not berating them now because they messed up and got ahead of you because they wanted to go around you. And since they went around you, now we have to fix it. And so try to figure out what those things are and what skills do we need to build. And you have to do that throughout the organization so that you and your group are helpful. And then the management becomes, I wouldn't say becomes easier, but you can see, okay, for this person, I might have to do something a little differently, right? Maybe someone, Carlene, you have to start 2 months, and others, you don't need to start in a month and a half. They're like, why are you bothering this month and a half thing? It's going to be the same thing. It's going to be the same slides, change the date, change the number. Why are you troubling me? And you say, okay, I trust you, but here's the drop dead deadline because it has to get to somebody else who needs more time. So you kind of work through those things. I don't know that the issues are different, but it's a people business. Unfortunately, we are not automated yet. So a lot of it is not cookie cutter because, I can't come in Winston Henderson, this is the way we're going to do things, because there are a lot of rocks that I can't move. Or if I move them, they disrupt the foundation. And so that's where you have to come with your people skills and say, okay, well, here's what I have to do. I have to be a little bit more like a basketball coach who has to coach 22-year-old millionaires. Like, can you imagine? And less like someone who is writing a book on leadership or management.
Thank you. Theresa or Carlene, do you want to add?
I think the only thing I would add is I think it's really important to also, I agree with all the things that Winston said, especially building trust and building relationships. But I think one of the things that we shouldn't be taken lightly when you're inheriting a pre-existing team is is getting their input and their feedback around the businesses, right? The business teams that they support, or that that the team is supporting. Because they can give you a perspective, especially if you're coming in new to the role or new to the company. It's always helpful. I mean, obviously, there may be biased views, right? And you'll hear people complaining about, certain individuals, but I think it's also helpful to get a good perspective on kind of what they've been dealing with, how they've managed relationships, how they've managed work in a certain way, which also helps you as a leader to figure out, start to determine, as Carlene said earlier, gap analysis, like how can we do things differently? How can we forge these relationships, or how can we improve these relationships? So I think that's just the only thing I would add, and everything that Winston said is really just taking advantage of learning from those individuals who've been there and been doing the work prior to you coming on.
And the other thing I would add to what Winston and Theresa said would be, when you first join a team, it's taking the time to kind of, to the extent possible, right? And for me, luckily, it's a research organization, very small legal team. So dive in as deep as possible, get your hands into everything in terms of all the transactions, all the agreements, to understand the business and observe and do the work yourself. So for the first year at Forsyth, I did probably 95% of the legal work, maybe 90%, if I'm thinking of employment law and some of the expert kind of areas. But I really dove in, and it took more time. I was working long hours through the weekends, those kind of things. But I really wanted to learn the organization so that coming out of it, I could understand the politics of it, understand the business relationship, and really start to build a sense of how I want to leverage outside counsel to effectively, so that the organization could be successful.
If I can just follow up, I think that's a great idea, Carlene. And one of the things that I did in my previous role was I actually had my team copy me on every email they sent out. And so that way I just kind of got a sense of, one, who are they working with in the company? Who are our stakeholders? What kinds of matters are they working on? Just to start giving me, like you said, an idea and a scope and depth of, what's the work in my team, that my team is responsible for. So that was something that was really helpful. I mean, I had thousands of emails in the first 2 weeks, but it was really helpful for me to just start to see a lot of the work and the relationships.
So I think now we may want to shift it to another poll question, which will help us dive into our next topic, the panel. Can we bring up the next poll? All right. So this is a true or false question. The duties of a legal department are the same for startup companies and public companies. All right. So what do we get? All right, 80% false, and then one person said it was true. So I think that that's a great segue into our next sort of topic area, which is this whole idea of startups versus public companies and something in between, right? And how do you manage based on, whether you're the GC or the associate general counsel or assistant general counsel or counsel, whatever your role is, what are you doing to help advance the ball? Because that's the most important thing, advancing the business. So I'll start with, I'm gonna tap Carlene because she has some great experience with early stage companies. Then we're going to sort of get a sense from Theresa because she has also some experience with later stage companies. And then Winston is going to sort of round us out with everything in between. And then we're going to sort of navigate towards a discussion around how we support and what are the top of mind legal issues that come up for public companies. So with that, we'll start with what are some of the top of mind issues, legal issues that you're navigating, Carlene, with startups in the early stage? What does it mean to be an early stage?
Sure. So as I mentioned, so I'm in a research institute environment, right? And I've been lucky, both environments. Previously, I was at the Charles Stark Draper Lab in Cambridge, and both environments are innovation environments. So there's a very strong appetite for commercialization of the technology, which means you're looking at IP portfolios, you're working with inventors, and you're trying to work things out to try to spin companies out to hopefully be successful and also have mission impact, because these organizations are kind of mission-based organizations. So in dealing with startup companies, even before they become a startup company, in an environment like Forsyth, it's working very closely with the inventor at the IP stage, right? So the inventor is developing IP within the environment, lots of harvesting type of sessions to identify key potential patentable IP that they're creating that might have commercialization potential. And so it's IP strategy is very critical when you're working with companies that are looking to become biotech companies or maybe tech companies. Having an IP portfolio is pretty critical. So very early on, when a company is formed, it's the founders' issues. So you have inventors who may become founders. And what type of company should I form? Where should I form the company, right? It's the formation, incorporation type of questions. And as founders, how do we split equity? How much equity should I take? Do I take investors at this stage, or do I try to bootstrap it with friends and family? And what I've realized as the attorney in those type of environments, when you're advising startups, advising inventors before they become startups, they're really looking for the lawyer to be pretty knowledgeable, almost a generalist, right? It's the business person with a legal background is kind of what they're looking for. And so I would say, so I mentioned it, IP is critical. So understanding not only patent strategy, if it's a patent, the different types of IP is important. If there's trade secret being created or other know-how, that's also very important. Understanding licensing strategy. So, if as an organization, Forsyth will license its IP to the startup, and the startup will pay licensing fees, revenue to Forsyth essentially. And so it's understanding the license agreements, licensing terms is pretty critical. And then partnerships. What are some of the early partnerships that these companies are entering into, whether it's in a beta stage of testing things or just first customers or first suppliers or collaborators, really working with them on those agreements to protect the organization, but also help them negotiate it in a way where there's a long-term relationship there, hopefully that will happen, right? Because ultimately, as the attorney in the room, the goal is to it's getting to yes. We've all heard of getting to yes, right? But it's true. You want to get your client to the point where their deal can happen in a way that's most supportive of the goal of the organization, but that facilitates the relationship and enables the business to thrive.
Perfect. So Theresa, so for other companies that are sort of in this later stage, same legal issues, or what sort of top of mind legal issues are prevalent for companies that are venturing into this later stage development?
So, I mean, I think there's some of the same issues as Carlene mentioned, I think, but as the company is growing and trying to kind of solidify itself, it may iterate and reiterate and iterate again on kind of how do they do business? What's the best way, as they've kind of tried and failed or tried and, realized like something didn't work that well, like how do we redo this? How do we do this differently? How do we do it better? So, you're working on kind of developing, updating the templates or updating the agreements that they have with customers, advising them on, kind of how do you structure the contract with a customer and do you take a loss? Do you have risk, right? In your services? There's also, as they begin to get more investors interested, there's also more, series, A, B, C, D, and other fund rounds. And so it's important to be able to help them through those documentations, but also making sure that, you resolve issues between the different levels of series so that there's the documentation is solid. You also, there's also, I know in my situation where customers were really interested in the business and they wanted to invest. So then it's like, how do you manage a conflict at a board meeting? They have an observer seat because they've given us, however much money, but they also can't hear about all the other work we're doing with all the other customers or kind of the strategy, or they shouldn't. So kind of making sure that there's, some kind of like firewalls or and measures put in place where there's a limitation on the exposure of the business strategy and the information. I think the other important thing really is the business is still running pretty fast. And so, having the opportunity to build an efficient legal team, putting in mechanisms and measures so that the legal and compliance function is growing with the company, and you're not doing a lot of bespoke things that take extra time every time, but thinking about long-term growth, like thinking about maybe a contract management system that needs to go in place that gives the business folks one opportunity to see what contracts we have in place, how have we drafted or negotiated, or what are some of the terms that we've agreed to, but also giving them some autonomy, creating templates so that they can start their own NDA or start their own conversations with customers by having access to templates, which relieves also your team from having to do everything initially. I think also putting in place a structure on how do we receive legal requests, because email and at my other company we use Slack and Teams, like that's not cutting it. You're not going to keep track of everything that people need from you through those mechanisms. So thinking about, like, again, systematically, what will help the function be efficient and effective, what will give your business stakeholders the tools to have access to you, but also to keep you accountable and to see where things are in place. And so I think those are also really important things to think about as you are growing through this different stages of your company. I think the other thing I would just say is, policies and procedures, drafting policies and procedures, having appropriate compliance training, especially if you are in a highly regulated industry, to show, whether it's your regulators, whether it's your customers, that, to show them that you have a compliance program, you have evidence of, employment training, how often people are trained. I think that, that's really important, especially in this, highly regulated industry. So I think, working closely, whether it's HR or your IT team, your securities team, those are, I think, really important things to start really, again, building a foundation and securing kind of a foundation for the growth of the company, so that you don't have to stop in the middle and come back and do it at a less opportune time.
So Winston, I'm going to turn it over to you. So going from startup to the later stage, fill in for me, from your experience, add on to what Theresa and Carlene said, but also it'd be great to get a sense of, usually startups, legal team is fairly small. So what happens if there's an issue that pops up that is definitely not in your expertise? How do you handle that with, a small budget, small spend, and a small legal team?
Yeah. So I can tell you, because I've cut my teeth on this, right? So I started off as the 7th employee. I actually think I was the 10th employee, but as those other 3 left, I tell the story differently. So, who's going to disagree with me, right? And it was really my chance to step out of law firm and be kind of really in the guts of innovation. And I was really an IP specialist at the time and had to learn all the rest of these things. And so I spent a lot of time building my network. right? Building my network of people who liked me and I liked them. They wanted to be close to interesting things. Some of them were my peers who wanted to be up and coming, and we would dream about who we were going to be when we grew up. And some of them were law firms that wanted to get into the new space, and so they were willing to invite me to breakfast and send me pages of things to pay attention to. And so I tried to build a practice of a formal and informal network of people who would say, listen, here are the things you got to pay attention to in the next 6 months. And I would study and try to be ahead of what I was going to face in my next stage. So by the time we were doing financing, I already knew how to, had already kind of been to school on that topic. And the first couple of times, that still was extremely dependent, not even acting like I was leading anything. I was kind of side saddle, almost second chair with outside counsel. It's not I don't have an ego in this. So part of my goal was to pick the best person and then, understand how to make the process go. But they were the expert, they were the lead, and I took a step back until I knew more of what I was talking about, right? In some later deals, and the organization was fine with that because they didn't want someone who wanted their career to be in front of what was there for the company. And so I go after most things humbly. I choose great people. I work to make sure that people internally trust me, but I don't have to be the smartest person in the room ever, right? I have to be the best general counsel and steward to make sure that people's stock portfolio, when the thing pops, is gonna be right. That's what they care about. And so I find I have kind of two classes of outside counsel. Those I call the sharpshooters, who can sit on the 100 feet and knock the buzzard out the tree. They know the substance so well. And then others who are just really smart and really savvy. And those are two classes that I don't question the bill that much because I know I get the value. The other bills I look at a lot more in detail on Saturday mornings and have some comments. And then I manage a spend. I kind of think about, where do I need some more budget because my expertise is lacking, or it's a new field, or it's so risky or so critical. And the other ones, I try to do a deal where I can manage down some of the HR things that, we just need to save budget on. And so that's kind of from a management standpoint, but kind of getting ahead of it, getting great people. I rely upon my outside counsel a lot, who are closer to the issues, to tell me what I should be paying attention to. They're studying the sheets, the tear sheets daily. I don't have time to do that, right? But I have time to read them, but I don't have time to be on top of what the issues are coming down the pike, especially when it's hot off the press regulation or regulation that's in the works that could be disruptive, right? You have to pay attention to all of that. And so that's been a really interesting piece for me to try to develop, getting on those listservs where people are in your industry bouncing issues, and you can shoot out some questions with non-proprietary information to get some really good answers. I think that's critical, especially in the startup space, because it just moves too fast. The issues move too fast. And by the time you master it, you're onto a new financing round, or you have institutional investors, or you're in the FDA space, and you really don't have time to move solely at your pace of learning. You have to make it independent, and that's difficult, right? It's very difficult. It's easier if you can be a likable person who people want to help. You'd be amazed at how many outside counsel say, you know what, I just like working with you. Can we have lunch and can we have breakfast? Because some of us in our profession are not that nice, right? So when they find someone who's agreeable, I find that the world kind of spins on a different axis, and it gets a little easier.
Especially when they're offering you free CLE for you and your team. Those are the best.
Absolutely.
What are the topics you'd like us to talk about? Can you give us an hour of this?
Right.
Happy to do it.
So, Stephen, understanding, you're not in-house. However, you support public companies. So taking us back to the original poll question of whether legal departments in-house at companies are, do they have the similar function? Are they dealing with the same sort of day-to-day legal issues? I'll turn it over to you to talk about how do you support public companies, and are the top of mind issues for the legal department similar, different, and how so?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I do support a range of companies, particularly in the life sciences space, and it's interesting to hear, Winston and Carlene and Theresa talk about it, because these are the things that we see, and some of the issues are the same. There is some overlap. So if you're in an industry, pre and post going public, you're going to be dealing with some of the same issues. But I think it's more of, and as Winston was saying, and also Theresa and Carlene, it's a maturity thing. As the company, as you have a startup, there's a certain set of issues that you're dealing with that Carlene spoke about. And then as you mature further down the line, there's more issues that Theresa and Winston were talking about. One of the things that I've seen in particular has been the transition in maturity in a company in the biotech space when they go public. And so that's a very particular set of transition points. It touches on a lot of different parts in the company. You will have a company that at that point, typically in my experience, they are, the founders are probably still attached. So you have companies that have been founded by certain founders. They're still around. They may even be the CEO of the company. If it's any kind of technology company, though, the founder is usually very steeped in the technology itself and R&D. And so unless you have a serial entrepreneur, a CEO who has taken other companies public, and there are some of those, and sometimes, management committees or boards will select those folks, this may be the first time they do this. And what I've noticed is that, there's a learning curve to moving from, a private company where the accountability of the CEO and the management team is to the board and to their employees to a certain extent, to now you're accountable to shareholders. And you're basically not only accountable to your shareholders and your investors, you're also accountable to the public. So you're accountable to the SEC and the DOJ and anybody who's seen, Elon Musk's Twitter feed and how he's run afoul with the SEC, you see that you can it's a different world. Whereas before you're public, you have to maintain the confidentiality of your agreements, and you're managing whether you're in stealth mode, when do you want to come out of stealth mode. It's more about the business. When you're a public company, it's all about the disclosures. And so before I talk about the disclosures, there's the transition from becoming a private company to a public company, and that's the IPO process. Now they have the SPAC process, which is it's a kissing cousin. It's basically the same. The corporate lawyers will kill me, but it's basically the same thing. I mean, the experience is going to be very similar. So you're going to have folks like me digging around and rooting around in all your agreements. You're going to have all kinds of folks like me in different specializations that are going to be pressure testing all your stuff. You're going to have potentially what is it called, accounting firms that are going to be going through all your books. And your folks who, you may have more of a family feel or a team feel as you're kind of hiring and growing. And now all that stuff is being really pressure tested and scrutinized, and it's not necessarily comfortable. In addition to that, it's a very intense process. And so the folks are looking at your stuff, there's a window of time, you're going on a roadshow, you're dealing with investment bankers. I mean, there's just a ton of stuff that you're dealing with. And then you start grappling with disclosures. So what are the things you're going to say in your S1? How are you going to characterize the business at that time? You want to, in my opinion, get good counsel who has done this before, but also very importantly, someone who you feel is going to pick up the phone and answer your questions, who's going to take you by the hand and lead you through this and not treat you like, yeah, we've done 100 of these before. We're going to take your prospectus. We're going to take your name off. We're going to put another name on it and just kind of like the printing press and just run you through the process. I think it's more advantageous to really think about, okay, how are you going to meet my needs as a company when I go public? And then finally, living life as a public company as I mentioned, it's all about the disclosures. So you're going to have a formalized disclosure process that you didn't have before. So you're going to have to set up an infrastructure about that. You're going to have to make those disclosures, and then you're going to have meetings and quarterly meetings about those disclosures. And what are you going to say? What is your standard practice for saying things? 10Ks, so you're going to do it quarterly, and then you're going to go do it yearly. In addition to that, there are certain events that happen. Could be, changing of a CEO, could be a certain data type event, and you're going to have to issue an 8K and a press release. And what do you say about those things? You're going to have to get guidance about those things. And then you have a whole set of communications that are governed by the SEC disclosure process. So you have analyst calls, and what is your CEO going to say there, and your management team going to say during those analyst calls? You have shareholder meetings, and you have CEO discussions. And one of the toughest transitions I've seen is when you have a CEO who has not worked or run a public company, try to transition to running a public company, and wants to say certain things. I mean, they're usually the company's biggest cheerleader, but he or she needs to be reined in by the general counsel. That has, in the companies I've observed that do this the best, there's a really good relationship between the general counsel and the CEO. That doesn't mean they do not disagree. There can be tension, but there is respect between the two of them. And I've seen it in real time where the CEO really wants to make a certain type of announcement or statement. And the general counsel is just like, you cannot say that. And it has to be resolved diplomatically. So those are some of the things that's how I would characterize kind of the trajectory of a company as they become more mature, they go public, how that transition can be difficult. And what are the different, it's the regulatory regime that is now applied to the disclosures that the company makes.
Doreen, can I make a breaker rule and double dip? I know you're going to kill me, but I would say that the way this usually comes up, we're now talking to people, right? In careers, is usually comes up in the skepticism of whether you can manage a larger group when you never managed a larger group, whether you can manage areas that are not your expertise, you're not litigating, not yet to commercial, or whether you are been there, done that, general counsel. Do you have the chops to move fast and do things and not just be a risk minimizer for a small company? If you're a small company, do you have the chops to step up and be GC or AGC of a public company? And that's kind of in a career things where you kind of get you get questions and doubt, and they're different enough that I think you do have to have a good answer. But I think that people get stopped a lot because people who are recruiters or others think they have the answer that you cannot do that. You're Steph Curry. You can't come from a small school and be a leading scorer in the NBA, and that's just not true. And so trying to find those sources of information and experience and advice that allow you to hop from industry to industry, so you're not locked in, hop from manufacturing to innovator, hop from small to public, from public to innovator. I think those are the things that we should be talking to each other about and telling them the how-to, rather than, it's different. Manufacturing is different than innovation. Can you do it? Yeah, you can, right? And you need to find yourself somebody who can give you the advice on how to do it, right? And can you be a small innovator GC and go to public company? Yeah. If someone can go from Senate to being president, someone can go from being a GC, a small company, to running, a public company after they shadow the outside GC who's been there for 4 cycles, right? Stephen, you do it 4 times, you kind of know what the rules are. And so I want to kind of dispel some of this is personal, right? My personal opinion, dispel some of the myths that I think kind of lock us out of not only opportunities, but even thinking creatively about, I want to do something different. I want to try something different. Can I do that? So sorry, Doreen, for interrupting there.
No problem. So I'm going to bring Gary into this conversation based on his past experience at Ropes and Gray and his current experience at Fidelity, to really bring into the conversation this idea about funding and how that helps to support startup ventures and work its way all the way through the process. And what is this thing called private equity? Can you speak to that?
Well, thanks, Doreen, and thanks for now making me go after Winston, because he's definitely a tough act to follow. So I'm happy to start this conversation and have someone else follow. But I guess to answer your question as cogently as I can, right? I mean, the way I look at private equity, right? When folks talk about private equity is usually when an investor buys a company, right? A buyout firm buys all the ownership stake in a company, whereas venture capital is an investor that's investing a minority position in a company that's not as mature as a private equity target per se. And to touch on the funding point, right? Most of these companies, particularly when they're not as mature as others, they need funding to fund new projects, fund R&D, to continue the operations, right? And to be able to fund a round, to have this injection of $100 million, right? To keep this company afloat and make sure that the ideas and the product it can come into fruition and be able to make it to marketplace. I mean, that's very important, right? And sometimes companies need the funding just for liquidity issues, right? Sometimes they just aren't solvent at the moment for whatever reason, right? Sometimes, I mean, when we think about tech companies, right? A lot of tech companies have high valuations, but sometimes they're not really generating revenue, right? Or they're not generating a profit, right? So the only way that these companies could continue is with either, you know, you continue, right, seeding rounds, or you have an exit event where you either get bought out by a private equity firm or you go public, right? And once you go public, I mean, that's kind of going back to what Stephen was just explaining, right? Then you kind of dive into this entire new reality, and right now you under the scrutiny of the regulators, and now you have to kind of account for disclosures, filings, and that's a big spend, right? And if you're not doing it right, that's going to affect your stock price, that's going to affect your brand, and that's something that you really have to take into consideration, and you really have to think about and contemplate it seriously, because that could be detrimental to your company. Whereas if you stay private, right now there's a different dichotomy, right? Because now the private equity investors, to a certain extent, well, they own the company, right? So now the board, instead of being an independent board for a public company, now you have a board that's essentially the private equity investors that injected money into your company. And now you're a portfolio company of a private equity firm. So in some ways, now you're at the behest of a private equity firm. I mean, that's probably the wrong word to use, but essentially the CEO has to really work with these private equity professionals and really have a good working relationship, because that's going to be advantageous to the company and to the CEO.
So Theresa, I want to bounce it to you to bring you back into the conversation with regards to this aspect around funding and just the whole sense of transactional and M&A sort of deals that happen as you're managing your legal department and your legal team. So I'm biased, I'm a litigator, and you know, some litigators may think that transactional work is boring. I'm not saying it's me, because I think it's very intriguing, to say the least, but would love to get your perspective here on how do the transactional matters, impact your day-to-day functions? Give us a sense of what does a day in the life of Theresa look like when you're managing interactions with clients and business teams and things like that.
Yeah, so thank you, Doreen, and I'm happy to share this question with anybody else who's would like to chime in. I think, as I mentioned before, in having worked not for a PE-backed company, but a company that had a number of venture capitalist companies who were investors, and so so those companies each have a representation on your board of directors, and as you kind of do these different rounds of funding, each investor may increase the amount that they've invested, or you may acquire new investors, or as I said before, even customers who would like to kind of be part of another round of funding. And so I think with all of that, it's really important to ensure that the documentation with regard to especially the company's corporate governance documentation, right? because as a private company, that's still part of that corporate governance area of focus and documentation, and ensuring that there's appropriate wording, that you've amended and restated things, that you have addressed appropriate opportunities for who owns how many shares and what are your rights to those shares, what are your opportunity to sell those shares, who gets a right of first refusal if you're interested in kind of selling your shares. And so all of those kind of pieces are really important as you're supporting the company and drafting in those documents. And I don't want to say it's a negotiation, because it's kind of it's all internal, right? It's all kind of an internal process with regard to the investors, the board of directors, the funders. But it is really important to have solid documentation and ensure everyone is on board and understands what needs to be and how things need to be addressed. I think the other thing that is really important is conflicts. I think I mentioned it earlier, but there could be potential conflicts depending on the roles of investors and whomever they appoint from the company to be on your board. What else is that person involved in? Are they in an area? Do they have a job at another company that could be a conflict with kind of the strategy that your business is in? And how do you address that appropriately? How do you document that? And so that's really important as well to capture those things. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm not an M&A lawyer, but those things I've definitely been involved in from a private company perspective. I mean, on the other side of a public company, and I don't want to jump the gun, but the whole M&A piece that fell under my purview was all the securities reporting and filings that are associated with an acquisition, right? And it starts from from the minute you sign the agreement, right? It's like, okay, as Stephen mentioned, we got to do an 8K. We're doing a press release that we signed this. Let's 8K it, and then and all the other forms that have to be signed as you are changing over executive leaders, and who's getting what stock portfolio or what stock options, or and who's getting what, and now who are going to be your directors. And so that's all really important to an important piece that's part of the public company purview, is that those disclosures and making them timely. I mean, you literally have 24, 48, 3 days to get this right. And so everybody's in a hurry to review the documents, to make sure you got the numbers right, to make sure you is this how we said in the press release, or is this like making sure that there's symmetry, because you want to make sure there's consistency with how you disclose those things, and you're working very tight timelines, and sometimes in the middle of the night when you're really tired and you've had too much coffee anyway, and so you really are working against the gun, against the grain and against the gun. But that's been my the other experience I've had with regard to M&As. I mean, the other thing is also the due diligence involved with an M&A work, right? And all the documents that need to be read, and because there's usually a limited number of people who they want to get involved with the diligence, because you don't want to have to open a window that's too broad for everyone to have access to confidential information. So then you really have to think about, okay, what do I need to know? But what are my stakeholders who don't have access to this diligence room? What is it that they might be thinking of that I should be looking for? What do the insurance policies look like? What do their D&O policies look like? And other things. So really important to be thorough when you're doing the diligence, because of the limited number of people who have access to the documents, who are asking you, those who know about the deal. Those who don't, you're thinking for them, right? And there's always someone who wasn't involved, who is upset after the fact, like, well, I wasn't involved in this. Did you know about, this, the CISO was left out. So did you ask about their security measures, info security and their privacy, and how do they do this? And so I think that's really important. And then on the other end of it is the integration, right? So once you've successfully closed the acquisition, what's the integration process? And, I served on the integration management office more than once in my career. And again, it's very, very detailed. A lot of people asking questions around, can we start doing this? Can we start having meetings? Can we start getting this information? And you really have to give them the right advice on, so you don't gun jump, right? And they don't start, kind of directing the acquired company before we're able to, but also kind of being thoughtful around ensuring that the redundancies are kind of corrected with the two organizations. Trying to figure out like who has, which system is best for procurement, which system is best for contract management. I mean, so this is where it really goes beyond legal a lot of times. This is where it really is important for you to be a good business strategist with your stakeholders, because even though they're asking you legal questions, they think it is, usually the answer is not really a legal answer. It's just, what makes sense. And so I think that's really important on the back end also of an acquisition is, the integration process. And then as Stephen probably well knows, and maybe Gary and others, but, then how do you make sure that the stock is delisted, from the NASDAQ for the new company, and going through that process and making sure that, you cut off the ability to anybody to exercise options, at a certain point when you're nearing the close of the acquisition. Having, scheduling earnings calls, right? Knowing that it might be the day or two before you're planning on closing, but you don't know if anything's gonna happen in the closing. So you're really trying to figure out like timing and what do you say and how do you say it so it doesn't seem like 2 days later you kind of lied 2 days earlier, but taking into consideration what actually can you disclose and how should you disclose it. So those are also other areas and other things that come up. I'm sorry if I was too wordy on that.
No worries, no worries. So I want to bring Stephen in for just a couple of minutes to talk about how someone, external counsel, helps to support the transaction type of work or matters that in-house folks are getting, startup to late stage to public companies.
Absolutely. And maybe I can start off in the M&A context. In the M&A context, you're going to have usually two sets of outside lawyers. You're going to have what we call the target. So the target is the company that's being acquired. They're going to have legal representation. And then you're going to have the company that represents the private equity firm, similar to the firms that Gary's working with. And my analogy, the analogy I've been using for these transactions is it's like buying a house. So when you buy a house, you have a bunch of inspections, and then you get reports from those, they look at the roof, they look at the foundation, this leaks, that leaks, this should be fixed, and then you have a negotiation over those points. The diligence process that Theresa was talking about in the M&A context is very similar. So you'll have on the private equity side, you'll have these lawyers, and I've worked as a specialist on some of these transactions, looking at the IP assets, because a lot of the times in the technology space, those are some of the most important assets, some of the most critical assets that you look at. There, as I mentioned before, we're going to be crawling around looking at all your agreements. The counsel on the side of the target is going to be producing those agreements. And basically, the lawyers are talking to each other, trying to figure out, if I'm representing the private equity firm, what is it, asking questions of the target, and then the counsel for the target is presenting those answers. So that's the diligence process. Parallel to that, you will have the agreement under which the acquisition happens, the M&A agreement, and that's a voluminous, or depending on the type of acquisition, could be an M&A agreement, could be a stock purchase agreement, depending on the type of transaction. And that's a voluminous agreement that is negotiated between the parties as well. And so it's still basic customer service though. So if I'm representing a company that's being acquired, I want to make sure that the general counsel feels comfortable, that we are taking care of it, that we're very responsive, and that we're not over disclosing, but at the same time trying to get a transaction done. And then if I'm working, and it's similar if I'm working on the private equity side, I'm trying to make sure that they have all their questions answered, that we're asking really business related questions. There are legal questions, but the number one question in my mind is, what are the things that could interfere with the running of this business moving forward? And that's what I'm paid to suss out. And so that might take the form of doing a very detailed analysis on the patent portfolio, or figuring out exactly the terms of a very complex collaboration agreement non-compete. But at the end of the day, I have to present that, as Winston was saying, in like bite-sized chunks in a very understandable way, to the stakeholders and to the general counsel, and also in a way that the general counsel can speak with authority when they pull up the chain and talk to their CEO.
Perfect. So far, we talked about structure for the in-house folks, structure of your legal department. Then we talked about your management style, managing down. And then we also talked about the different stages, startup stage all the way to the public company stage. And now I really want to focus on managing up. So managing relationships with your peers, who are your peers, and also managing and what is your sort of relationship with the board of directors and that whole piece. How do you prepare for that? How do you prepare for committees? And so I know that Carlene had mentioned this a little bit earlier about preparing for presentations to the board. So Carlene, I'm going to jump it over to you to sort of talk about, in your role, what is your relationship with the board? How does your legal department prepare for reports to the board? And are there committees? How do you report up?
Sure. So as general counsel, I'm also secretary of the board at the Institute. And so I interact with the chair of the board quite often. If she has any questions about the governance documents, around scheduling, even when it comes to the organizational kind of committee meetings, strategy around certain things that may be coming up that the board will need to discuss and make decisions on, she'll often reach out to me as the corporate secretary, but also as the general counsel, to get my legal opinion as to what approach the organization should take or she should take going into a meeting. So in the role as corporate secretary, the interaction with the board and as general counsel is preparing for the board meetings that happen on a quarterly basis, also preparing for the committee meetings. And so that's meeting with the committee chairs of the board of directors to make sure that we're identifying the agenda for the meeting, and working with those committee chairs to develop whatever the content is that they're looking to discuss in those meetings. So for example, if it's a modification to the governance documents, you're preparing those modifications to be presented. What I found during the COVID time is it's become a real production, right? Because everything's on Zoom. And so what I had to do is take a step back and think about, how do I make it easy for the board members to experience this meeting? And so in addition to the process that I mentioned, where we're planning pretty early on from agenda and really working through the process, we've also developed a very structured kind of slide deck, right, with the CEO, because I work super close with our CEO. Someone mentioned here that you really need to have a very tight relationship with the CEO to be able to be on the same page. You might not agree on everything, but it's the mutual respect and being able to move the ball forward together. Like it's a he in my case, I'm on his team, right? He has a vision and I'm there to help him execute that vision, develop the strategy to execute the vision, and to be able to convince everyone along the way that we're going to make it and we're going to be successful in doing it. And so it's working really closely with the CEO to develop a real tight slide deck that controls the experience for the board and makes that meeting very smooth so no one's lost during the process. And I also use a member of my team as the production person during our board meetings, believe it or not. So she's on and she's controlling the slides for the meeting while I am able to kind of focus on the substance, and we're able to literally kind of move things along and make it a pretty cool kind of seamless experience. So in this role, I manage up a lot. It's a lot of conversations with the CEO, transparency in terms of what I'm thinking, lots of conversations with the board, but managing that, right? Because with the board and management, it's a very interesting kind of relationship, right? You answer questions when you're asked, but you're not necessarily offering, certain things either, because there's a real line there that you have to know when to operate within the side of management. And if there is an issue that requires board to weigh in, to know when you need to elevate it to get that perspective to make sure that you're protecting the organization. So it's been fascinating. And also I know we've jumped onto another topic. For those litigators who haven't tried their hand in corporate law, do it. It's actually a lot of fun. And the transaction training that you get, especially if you go on, you get your training in a firm environment. And if you're thinking that you want to be in-house eventually, that training really prepares you for the in-house setting. And so any opportunity you get to do diligence on M&A deals or whatever it might be, get that experience, because it's really going to benefit you in the long run. So.
I completely agree with you on that one. Absolutely. So Gary, I'm going to pull you in and give maybe a different perspective on managing upward at Fidelity, as well as how do you prepare for interactions or meetings with the board?
So to take a step back at Fidelity, and I'm sure at other private companies, a lot of decisions that are brought before the board are socialized before, right? Because you want to have, in essence, you want the board to know what's going on at all times. Well, for us, right? Because it is a family-owned business, right? So at a high level, you want the board to know what's going on, and the board meeting is more of a formality, right? And we prepare a deck. A deck is prepared to that summarizes some of the pertinent information that's happened throughout the quarter, investments, minutes that they're being approved from last quarter, and what legal does, legal makes sure we ensure that the operating agreements are being adhered to, right? So usually in the operating agreements, right, the agreement prescribes when a consent is required or when board action is required, and that's to a certain effect, that's what we're making sure is happening at the board meeting. But also we're also making sure that everything is being properly documented, right? Because I mean, regardless, there's still regulatory scrutiny on all these businesses, whether it be a private company or a public company, right? It's just more heightened when you're public. But I would say that managing up can be difficult at times, because because board members, no matter what company they're sitting on, they're pretty busy people, and a lot of times you need to chase them around for consent, or you need to socialize something with them that is going to appear before the board, and you want to give them that professional courtesy, like to make sure that they know, hey, I'm on your team and this is going before the board. I really want, we really want you to be aware of this and to take a look and to give us your thoughts before it goes before the entire board, so we could kind of iron out any wrinkles and make sure that any issues are attended to. The other aspect of it is in my experience, what I also try to do is double check all the information. So sometimes I'll take a pass at the financials that are being presented, and I'll compare them with last quarters or last years, just to make sure that the numbers, I mean, I'm not putting in the numbers, but just to make sure that the stuff makes sense, because sometimes folks make mistakes, right? And although that's not my responsibility, I do think that's part of my job, because, right, we're the ones that are making sure that all the documents are in order and that everything is in check. So that's another thing that I try to do. I try to review all the documents just to take a quick pass, the financials, to make sure everything's okay. We liaise with finance, because obviously they have to provide the financials, and they help us prepare for the board meeting as well.
Perfect. So I'm going to throw this to Winston. And while Winston is responding to this last question, we're going to close it up because we're running out of time. But to prepare for closing remarks, would love for each of the panelists to think about, maybe providing one or two nuggets or keys to success for the folks that are looking at this right now and who will be viewing it, because we will be posting this for others to view. So my question to you, Winston, is, generally speaking, people within companies tend to think of or consider the legal department as the department that always says no. How do you manage that? And how do you manage business expectations and relationships within the company?
That's a really good question. I think that the typical perceptions are no, or slowing things down, or highlighting things that are not, quote unquote, as important, right? So there are things that, and it's not always negative. It's just that if you are the sales or the innovator, or you're the person who wants to do it, and you've convinced yourself that it's the right thing to do within your parameters, you don't want someone saying, but you can't do that, right? For whatever reason, or you can't do that before this. And so, but the structure of the law and the structure of the organization, and the reason why your hindquarters are in that chair is to sometimes say no, right? So in some ways, it is getting the fortitude to say, I'm only here because something should not be done, or be done that way, or be done in this way. And otherwise they don't, so it's getting the confidence to say, if I'm not needed, or I'm here to do this. And the question is then, how do I do that, right? Ideally, you get ahead of the things to say, where somebody looks across the room, and sometimes my peers, they say, Winston, I know what you're gonna say, right? That's when I know I've done my job, because they already know the issue that we're gonna have to talk about, and then we can spend some time on the issue. They already know it. So I don't have to open my mouth. And sometimes I just sit back and I say, I know what you're gonna say. And they play devil and angel. And by the time it comes to me, I'm like, so you've already thought through this, right? And then I'm not an impediment. So there's a personal thing we talked about before. And then it is really, do I have enough command of the prioritization of the issues, right? So in early stage, you'll be doing a financing round, and there are all kinds of things. And you want to do them expertly, and you want to do them as you were taught in law school, and as your CLE said, and as your outside counsel says. And the CEO looks at you and says, we need to just pack up and go home now, right? Because you have to raise the money, so that you have to figure out a way to be the advisor, the business partner, the coach, right? And yet, as Theresa and Carlene says, sometimes you're in the boardroom and they're looking at you because you have the role that's going to tell the truth, and you're like, I don't want my face to tell. Where Carlene says that you don't have to tell, but they're looking at you, they're looking at everybody else, but they're looking at you to say, okay, I'm going to see what this general counsel face twitches when I ask this question, because I know they've done their job, and I know they have different rules where the business person can, let's just say, be creative. And so I think that Sometimes it's a lot of fun, but trying to build your own style to say, trust me, when I'm an immovable object, when I'm lighting my hindquarters on fire, you have to realize I'm doing it for the company. I'm not doing it because I'm being a difficult person. So you have to develop that rapport and that ability to communicate big issues from small issues. Everything can't be fire, and everybody can't be the same issue. And you have to come up with creative solutions and that allow people to understand that you're that type of person, that you run your function in that way. And then you have to deliver on that, because the business does actually have to take some risk, right? And I'll never forget this, and I promise I'll wrap it up in 15 seconds. When I was junior, remember, even when I was junior, I was the only counsel there. So ain't nobody else ahead of me to be senior, right? And so they, we were going through some really sophisticated deals with some tier 1 folks. And I was highlighting some things because that's what you do. And my team looked at me and said, Winston, we just told investors that we can do something that biologically has never been done before, that we can do it in 2 years and on budget. You try to tell me that you can't find a more creative, better solution within the law? But like, it's everybody in finance is coming up with numbers as best they can. Everybody in the organization is doing things. I think sometimes lawyers, they've never been that business person, they've never been that board member. So they're very doctrinal. In a lot of ways, that's not fair, because the rest of the organization is taking significant risk that they will get sales next quarter. How? They don't even know. They're going to split DNA. Ain't never been done before in the history of the world, part 2, right? It's never been done. And so they want the lawyers to say, can you be in here with us? Keep us safe, risk adjust, but can you be a part of the team that understands what we're talking about? And yes, you're part of the thing that's risk minimizing and keep us, but being that part of the team member, conveying that you understand what they're doing, conveying that you understand the salesperson's job, conveying that you understand the CFO's job, conveying that you understand the CEO's job and the board and the investors who put in the money, goes a long way. But I think that some of us have to I don't care if it's a monopoly sake, get yourself a game and play those different roles, because then you'll understand why sometimes they say that we are the way we are.
That was great. All right, so I warned everyone that it was coming. Why don't we give these folks a few nuggets or a few takeaways? So Winston and I had this debate the other day around, showing your hand, giving the keys to success. So understanding that we've got law school students, we've got in-house folks, we've got people from firms here, and that will be viewing this video recording. Give folks some nuggets. And, given that we are the NBA and the Women Lawyers Division, what are some nuggets for women of color, people of color who aspire to be in your roles? How do they get there? Or if they're at a firm, how can they get some work? So let's go to Carlene first.
Sure. So I want to piggyback off of what Winston just said, because it's so critical. And so I want to repeat it as I understand what you said, Winston, which is my first nugget. It's being the business person with the legal background, right? So that means you're coming to the table, you have to be practical as the lawyer. When you're advising the company, you have to be able to deep dive and really understand the business and be curious, right? If the company is developing technology, whether it's a life science, technology, or maybe it's like biotech or whatever it might be, you want to really be curious and try to understand the product, the service, whatever it is that's being offered. Because if you're at the table as the business person that is the business person with the legal background, when you raise your hand with that red flag to say, oops, we can't do this because I have serious concerns, people take you really seriously and they listen. And it's less of a pushback and it's more of a, okay, so we flagged this issue. How do we get to where we still want to go and make sure that we don't trip anything up and we address that specific issue? The other thing, the other nugget, because I know we're running out of time, would be that don't be afraid to take risks, but in the sense of coming from, so I came from private practice. I was 8 years in private practice. I did M&A, venture capital work. And before that, I was a technology research analyst. So I brought a lot of different skill sets to the table. When I got to in-house, I had to take a step back in my first in-house role at Draper and really think about how do I combine some of those skill sets and bring them to the table. If I'm in a business meeting and I notice something that comes up and I think, wait a minute, I've seen this before. If the endowment for the institute, we're talking about getting an investment manager to manage the endowment. Well, I've done that before in a different context in private practice doing investment management work, but that means on the company side, I now can help guide the process from the legal standpoint in terms of diligence for those type of companies. So it's taking risk and combining the knowledge that you have and being comfortable to speak up and share that, because eventually the pieces kind of fall into place and the general bigger picture comes into focus.
Perfect. Gary, what about you?
I would say overall career advice, I mean, the best advice that I got is to understand that my job is not to know all the answers, but to ask the questions, right? Just be able to know how to ask a good question and be able to get to the root of what's important and what's at issue, right? Because sometimes you may think that something's important or something's an issue when it's really not. But if you don't ask the question and if you assume things, then you're not going to get the answer. I would also say to be committed, right? Whether you're at a law firm or you're in-house, right? You're always going to be part of a team, and you want and I guess this is kind of piggybacking off what Winston said earlier, which is you're part of a team, right? And everyone has to play the position, whether it be you're a junior associate at a law firm or you're in-house at a Fortune 500 company, right? You're part of a team. You need to play a position, right? Everyone knows who Shaquille O'Neal is, right? No one expected him to hit free throws, right? But people know the value that he had because of what his job, what he was tasked to do, he did extremely well. And I think that that's the mentality that folks should adopt, right? No matter how minuscule you think the task is, that it feeds into a bigger picture that right, that you're contributing to something that's bigger than you, that you're contributing to a team. And so you have to be nimble, but be committed and don't be scared to ask questions.
Stephen?
Sure, I'll keep mine brief. It's very similar to what everyone else said. I think, so I got 3 bullets. One is similar to what Gary said, commitment to excellence. Try to be excellent in what you do, whatever it is. The benefit of that redounds to the organization, but it redounds even more greatly to you to learn those practices of how do you become excellent at something. And it's hard, but I think it's worthwhile. I think the second thing that helps that commitment to excellence, as Carlene mentioned, is the curiosity. So being curious about the things that are happening around you, or in a professional sense, being curious about the transaction, why we're doing it in a certain way, being curious about the technology that you're dealing with at the time. And I think the third thing, which kind of enables those other 2, is empathy. So have empathy and understanding of the people that are around you, both in terms of, who your internal, let's say your internal or external client, what are they trying to get accomplished? If you were in their shoes, what would you need? And then trying to provide that or trying to address that while staying in your lane. So I think those are the things I would offer.
Winston?
I'm just gonna, I had some things written down, but since you teed up, Doreen, I'm gonna talk about 2 things. One is, Steve, I wanna add to what you said. One of the things is be self-aware. So I know that the empathy and compassion come close to me, come easy to me. Sometimes on HR or other issues, I have to have a heavier hand in the room to say, okay, let's think about this, right? And you come with something because I know that I come to it from a certain perspective and I want somebody else's perspective to balance where I come to it from. Everybody's human. So I think being very self-aware. I know that I have strong suits. I come to certain substantive. Those who deal with technology companies, you're dealing with a company full of PhD and MDs, right? There's no way that they can understand each other, let alone the lawyer understanding it. So I'm very self-aware, saying, okay, I need, and I sometimes I hire tutors, right? And coaches and some other things to say, listen, I need to figure out how to get very good at that. Help me synthesize that, and also give myself the confidence to perform in that type of environment. There's no shame to it. Like I said, the president has to do that. Like you got to say, okay, you got to sit down with Putin and Netanyahu and foreign policy and the Fed, and you are a state senator, whatever. So you get what I'm saying. You have to have some type of way of taking up that space and doing it expertly. But what Doreen and I were talking about was among people of color and women, do we need generic advice, or do we need someone to say, okay, yes, study for your law school exam, study for the bar exam, but that's not enough. Get yourself into a Barbie class and take some practice exams. Like, there are keys to the kingdom that says, how do I excel above the generic advice? How do I ascend to partnership? How do I get that first GC position? How do I switch into, from a manufacturing technology company into an innovation economy when I know the headhunters are not looking for me? How do I get into public? Like, how do I, and I see other people doing it. I see other people starting companies at 19, having no experience, but then you want to check someone who has 25 years of experience. They don't have enough of the right type of experience with Section 102. Give me a break. So I think that's where I say, get yourself a network of people who see the potential in you and the actual you. So they can say your actual you needs to be better here, but the potential in you, I see, and here's how I think you can get there. I think the networks to say, listen, people are going to tell you that this public company stuff is so difficult and all these transactions. Listen, here's a template. Study that. I highlighted the things you really have to that go well. People do these deals. Morgan Stanley does these deals in 3 days. You think everybody went through those documents? No, there's certain things they care about. There's certain things they don't, right? And there's certain things that are market and certain things. So if you only have those 3 days, here's what you do. Here's what you don't want to screw up. Here's what you want to make sure you know, so your CEO hears this 4 or 5 times before he has to go on the talk shows. Those are the things where I think you make life a little simpler. And then where it's really complex, make sure you have people who demystify it. They don't say, here's a book on calculus. Go learn. Yes, calculus is tough. Aren't you a teacher? Like, can you help somebody out here? Can you break it down into modules and steps so that that's a thinking smart person can actually do it? Because the stuff, you're a litigator, stepping into corporate is like, reading hieroglyphics, but it's not. Lawyers do it. And some aren't as sharp. So that it can be done. And so I'm saying, find your outside counsel, find your network, find your plan, especially if you say you want to do something in 5 years. You got 5 years to study. So, what books are you reading on vacation again? Let me see that again, right? Are you serious about this? And then as far as getting work, develop relationships. One of the things that I do that I think we do poorly, and I see this time and time again with junior people or partners, you go to an event, you meet great folks, they go head down because they've been told, stay the head down, do your work, and you make partner. Now, usually the white male counterpart is inviting me to all matter of things. So by the time they're 5 years in, I know them. And I've been trying to keep in contact with the person of color or the women associate 5 years, and they don't have time. Then they come up for partner, or they know they need to develop business. And I'm saying, like, what did so I think that we can give people the keys to the kingdom in some of these practices and building companies. And then there are those of us who are trying to build, right? It's not all about the big public company. If you haven't noticed, a lot of times the big public company is 3 people right now, and in 2 years will be 2,000 people. You're so busy chasing the 2,000 person that you forget about the young brother and sister who's actually trying to build something, right? So I think that some of the ways we try to see some potential in each other and actually demystify this really complex world, it's not so complex that it can't be done. It's just that you want someone to demystify it, the wheat from the chaff. That's what Doreen did. We were pairing back and forth. That's what we were talking. I'm a big fan of, listen, if you're gonna give me advice, don't give me the same advice. Give me the Barbie book and the practice exams also.
Yes, and you're also big on accountability partners, right? Theresa, let's round that off.
Well, there's been so many good nuggets. I'm trying to like all the ones I had are gone.
Did you freeze, Theresa?
I think she dropped the mic. She dropped the mic.
Oh,
Here.
no.
Can you hear?
Yes, we got you back.
Sorry. See, that's what happened when you leave me to laugh for last. My internet gets unstable. So I would just say be collaborative going into things and making sure that you reach out to people, that you learn from. I think your business stakeholders are really good people to learn from, to learn a new area. If you're interested, to learn a new industry, to learn a new area of law, to learn just, a new business. Business folks are really smart, and they can kind of help you come kind of along as you are learning a new space. I think so. It's important to be collaborative. I think also being confident in yourself and being open to be stretched is really important. I think there's an opportunity, even if you didn't start out as a generalist. If you started out in a niche area, being open to getting those stretch opportunities, or when someone says, "Hey, we need someone to do this," raise your hand. You may have a lot on your plate. You may have other things to do, but if you really want to think about the long term for your future, raise your hand. Take advantage of those opportunities when they come your way, or seek them out, right? Through networking and through getting to know people. Seek out mentors as well. I tapped a few people to mentor me, before they, had a chance to say no. I was like, oh, by the way, I need you to help me with this. So I think those are the only other additional things I'll add, especially to some of the, junior folks coming up, or mid-level attorneys coming up who are trying to figure out, what's their long-term plan.
Well, I want to thank all of you very, very much for being on this panel. I think that this has been absolutely phenomenal. You've given a lot of great insight into transactional work and startups and public companies. And I want to thank everyone who joined us and everyone who is watching this as a recorded webinar. And thank you for supporting us this year. We've had a lot of great webinars starting in September, and this is our last one. And we just want to thank the NBA and the WLD for its support for all of these great programs, where we were strategically able to highlight and showcase just such talented people of color, Black women, Black men, in all of the different areas that we touched this year. I am really looking forward to, and so is Ebony, with continuing on this path of giving another year of great webinars starting in September. So we will look forward to giving you another great year. And we look forward to seeing all of you in person at some point. So thank you again for joining us, and have a good evening.